Record, and we're going to have this also available on videotape for those people that weren't able to make it today but still want to, again, be curious enough to know the end of the story. I oftentimes look at this lecture here as this really separates the people who are here because they want to learn compared to the people who go, yeah, I sort of need a grade. And I would certainly hope by the time you're in an advanced level class, you want to learn and not just simply, have a check off on a requirement and get a grade. Anyway, we were talking about the new topographics movement and style of photography last week, and we're going to kind of clean up and finish up with that and then move on into some other artists. This is a young Stephen Shore here being interviewed by Andy Warhol. And Stephen Shore, in his later years, comes to be another major photographer in the new topographic style. He was actually given a darkroom kit as a child back in the days when you used to get like chemistry sets and stuff like that for Christmas, when they actually trusted kids to actually be careful because they'd be supervised by their parents. And so he learned how to make photographs and was impressive enough that at age 14, Edward Steichen, the director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, saw one of his prints and bought a print of his when he was 14 years old. And so by age 17, he's working with 35 millimeter and he starts hanging around Andy Warhol's factory, okay? And he begins to document all of the things that are going on in Andy Warhol's studio, which again was known as the factory. So here he is photographing the Velvet Underground as they are again in this place. There is now an entire book of Shore's photographs because this is considered such a kind of important period and such an important kind of like focal point in early 60s art. So at the age of 24, he got a solo show of his black and white photography at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That was 1971. He was actually the second living photographer after Alfred Stieglitz to receive a solo show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And following that, he felt like he really needed to make a change in his work. And so he was going to be driving to the West Coast, and before he left on his trip for the West Coast, he bought a view camera. And he said, okay, I'm going to really change it up. And artists do this. They'll say, okay, I've been doing something for a while. I want new challenges. I don't want to peak too early and get into a rut too early. So he begins to photograph with an 8x10 view camera. And so this particular photograph here is... This is not Los Angeles, Arizona, 1974. Pennsylvania, 1974. And again, the new topographics style that was emerging in this era was growing out of the snapshot aesthetic, but bringing with it the precise detail of large format cameras. And it's an anti-art style. It's oftentimes anti-composition, anti-content, and so people are trying not to use dramatic light, like, say for instance someone like Ansel Adams. They're not trying to make scrupulously organized compositions like Henri Cartier-Bresson, and they're not trying to, collect anything that has actually any social commentary to it, like say for instance Robert Frank. And the stuff actually honestly kind of drives me nuts because I oftentimes think to make a new topographics photograph, you could set up a view camera on a tripod and loosen the ball head on it and spin it 360 degrees in a circle and let it spin until it stops. Squeeze the cable release in whichever direction it's pointing in. You got a new topographics photograph, right? And people say, wow, what a kind of like non-composition that is. And look at the nominal subject matter that's there. And this was a new, exciting idea to photographers, to critics, to writers on photography. And as photography is now in the 70s being sold in art galleries, being embraced by more and more museums, it becomes more and more esoteric. And so the fact that the average person doesn't get it actually becomes a selling point for it. Again, I am curious, what is the decision-making process that leads people to stop and make a photograph in this parking lot rather than the next parking lot or the next parking lot after that? I actually drove all the way to Chicago to see Stephen Shore speak at a lecture, hoping I would get some sort of understanding of his work, and didn't feel like I got any more understanding of it than when I left, or when I had left for the lecture. Stephen Shore's work is oftentimes described as being peripheral, as in dealing with the peripheral field of vision, things that you see out of the edges of your eye, being reductive, where no element dominates the work. You can see the influence of Andy Warhol, where Andy Warhol specifically chose bland subject matter, Campbell soup cans, Brillo boxes, things like that, so that it challenges the expectations of the viewer. Some phrases that are used to discuss this kind of work is that the work all has a studied disinterest, and it contradicts all of the normal expectations of what a photograph should be. And interestingly, this type of work is regaining popularity very profoundly as we cover contemporary photography. The German photographers such as Andreas Gursky and people like that, trying to think of other people, Wolfgang Tillmans, English photographer, they are very much influenced by the new topographic style. But this is from a series he did about baseball from 1978, and trying to photograph baseball with an 8x10 view camera seems almost kind of ridiculous because you can't even freeze action with it. But again, it's that contradictory attitude, that kind of willful, kind of like swimming against the stream, that has made other curators interested in this work, and that it was new. And of course, for Stephen Shore, color was a new thing. Just looking at a couple of other new topographic photographers, and then we will transition into our next topic. But this is the work of Louis Baltz. And Louis Baltz is a photographer who is the only part of the whole new topographic movement who actually worked with 35 millimeter. But he used a special film called TechPan, which back in its day, the advertisement was that it had such fine grain that it would rival the sharpness of 4x5 film. He photographed industrial parks in Irvine, California, and made a very influential body of work where we normally think of industrial parks full of like job shops and nondescript industrial buildings as not especially powerful subject matter. Louis Baltz, I think, actually better conforms to my old-fashioned aesthetic, in that there's still elements of kind of geometry and plays of light and shadow that he brings to his work that you don't see in like the work of Robert Adams or Stephen Shore, who we just looked at. And the European wing of the new topographics movement was actually a husband and wife team of Bernd and Hilla Bescher. And they were art instructors. Actually, they met while they were studying painting at the Dusseldorf Academy, and then they married. They both began to teach at the Dusseldorf Academy, and they began this project of photographing different pieces of vernacular architecture like water towers here, and they would specifically go for as undramatic as possible. They would use only overcast days for making their photographs. If the sun came out, they wouldn't make a photograph. They would always use dead center composition, and then they would very frequently grid their images together, again showing the influence of Andy Warhol, into where you see similarity and repetition and then variation within that repetition. So here, water towers from 1988. This particular one here, this is cooling towers here from 1976. They released a book in 1970, their first of several books, entitled Anonymous Sculptures. And so they are looking at decaying elements of the last portion of the industrial age. We think of the 20th century as the age of modernism. And again, industrialism was something that was very new at the beginning of the 20th century. As we get to the end of the 20th century, we're starting to see these kind of dying, rusting carcasses of industrialization. And so they are documenting these and doing so in a very kind of flat, descriptive way with no emotional content whatsoever. So maybe influenced by, on the American side, Walker Evans and his documentary photography for the FSA. From the German point of view, remember August Sonder, who wanted to document every occupation and every socioeconomic class within the German people? The Germans, they just really like to categorize and document. They're very, very kind of organized. My friend, who is a Detroit native but now is an expatriate who lived for about 20 years in Germany, said he was shocked the first time he went to a German park and there were brass plaques on all the trees listing what sort of tree you were looking at for every tree in the park. So they get really into order and organization. The Beschers went on to teach, okay? The most famous of their students, Andreas Gursky, whose work we're going to look at in the final hour of today's class. And Gursky, I hope you know his name. He's probably one of the most famous contemporary photographers right now, but also Thomas Ruff and Thomas Struth, also very famous contemporary photographers, all studied with the Beschers. And this resurgence of new topographics style photography is sometimes now in the art world referred to as the new German school of photography, where these people who were grouped with the new topographics movement taught what they liked, and then they brought that to their students, who then began to practice it in a slightly different way, and what is old becomes new again. Okay, William Eggleston is maybe a photographer whose name you know of. Eggleston is a very interesting character, and again, a person who challenges expectations, is maybe in touch with the emerging zeitgeist, but as somebody who was at the early portion of the zeitgeist, created a fair amount of controversy because of the fact that people said, oh, your work doesn't seem to follow any existing model up until this point. Eggleston, by just about everything I've read about him, isn't a particularly motivated kind of guy. He attended 3 different colleges, 3 different universities, all in either Mississippi or in Tennessee, and never got a degree from any of them. He was born in Memphis. But he took up photography after seeing an exhibition by Henry Cartier-Bresson. And he never ever learned the darkroom, and so he would literally make either slides or drugstore prints, okay? And in 1974, he showed a box of drugstore prints to John Sharkovsky. And John Sharkovsky he was the director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art. He had taken over when Edward Steichen retired. John Sharkovsky decided to champion him. Around this same time, Eggleston was taking his work to a lab to have some prints made, some larger prints rather than just utilizing the drugstore prints that he had. And he saw the price list that was there for prints, and the most expensive prints there were dye transfer prints. And we saw a dye transfer print, I believe, when we went to the Detroit Institute of Arts. And he said, wow, it's like, it costs a lot. And then he thought, you know, it probably costs a lot because it's awesome. So he decided to have a couple of his prints made in the dye transfer process. When Sharkovsky saw them in this process, which up till now very few photographers utilized because it was extremely labor intensive, other than, trying to remember the one photographer who showed at the Alfred Stieglitz's gallery, nobody made dye transfer prints because of the fact that they were just too damn expensive and too difficult to make. So I'm looking for the name here because, of course, I'm blanking out. Elliot Porter. Sharkovsky arranged for more dye transfer prints to be made. And Eggleston comes from a background, and I'm not sure exactly what his backstory is, but it seems like he's never had a job. So I'm guessing he had enough money that he never needed to have a job, and therefore could afford what most artists couldn't afford, to have his prints made. Keep in mind, this is the post-Warhol era. So up until Warhol, it was kind of expected that artists made their own work. They always had a serious hand in making their own work. Eggleston is like, yeah, you know what? Here's a whole bunch of my slides. Make prints for me. And so in 1976, the Museum of Modern Art released a show of his work, and he was 26 years old, one-man show at the Museum of Modern Art. And anybody that's that young, anybody who gets a major show at the Museum of Modern Art, solo show attracts a fair amount of attention. Color was new. Hardly anybody did color, so color was a new and exciting topic in the 1970s. Part of the reason that color emerges in the 70s is, frankly, the invention of the roller transport processor, the type of processor that we still use in our darkroom downstairs. And making color prints in a home darkroom is hard, but as soon as there's machines where you load it in, and back in those days, 8 minutes later a print rolls out dry, all of a sudden people were starting to make color photographs. Eggleston's are especially beautiful color photographs because they are expertly made dye transfer prints. Yes?
Is that Sharkovsky you mentioned that was working with Eggleston? Is he the same guy that took Winograd's work when he died?
Yes. John Sharkovsky took over from Edward Steichen as the director of the Museum of Modern Art. He took a more active role in being a taste maker. Most curators collect things. They look and they say, okay, what is seemingly important from a particular era, and then they collect it. Sharkovsky, much more realizing that he could shape photography by who he anointed as being a star, who he could make famous. So he did that with Winograd. He did that with Friedlander and Diane Arbus, and he does it again with William Eggleston. And as we'll see, it creates a certain amount of controversy, and the reason for the controversy is that some of Eggleston's work, I think by traditional standards, is very intriguing, very important. It has a certain kind of interesting behind-the-scenes documentary feel, looking at the Old South. These are all just untitled from the William Eggleston Guide from 1976. Other photographs follow that kind of new topographic style of being like randomly bland in a way that people would look at them and said, really, this is worthy of like giving somebody a one-person show at the Museum of Modern Art as their first show they ever got, okay? Imagine that your first show, instead of being at the Lawrence Street Gallery or at the Hatch Collective or something like that, is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the highest place that you could ever achieve success and recognition in the United States. And that's your first show. And so people looked at some of these photographs and they're like, really? It's like somebody changed their oil in a parking lot and then they left the oil cans behind. What an interesting and deep insight that is, Eggleston is just a guy who walks around taking pictures all the time, and sometimes he photographs things that fall within the traditional expectation of what would make an interesting and compelling photograph. And other photographs are kind of like, what the hell photographs? Like, really? That was something that was worth making a dye transfer print of? Here a photograph of somebody lighting their barbecue. People will oftentimes point out the fact that the dye transfer process is such a beautiful, luscious process in reproducing color. And up till now, people hadn't seen very much color in color photography. They were just awestruck by it. And they'd say, wow, look at the red of that flame. Look at the color of that blue paint on the car. And other people would say, yeah, you know what, that's a snapshot photograph. It's like there's no real organization to it at all. And it was on. There was a ongoing kind of back and forth debate as to whether or not this guy was the new genius of photography or if he was a totally overhyped kind of fraud who didn't have anything other than a powerful friend who was backing him. It didn't help, of course, that Sharkovsky named the exhibition and the catalog that accompanied it the William Eggleston Guide, which seemed to imply that, oh, you aren't going to be smart enough to understand how this is important, so we will guide you to why this is important. And Sharkovsky, being a bit of a smartass, actually originally had toned down the title. Originally it was going to be titled William Eggleston's Guide to Perfect Color Photography. Couple of things. There's so much to talk about with Eggleston's work. One is we are entering the age of irony, which you guys live in right now and have been living in for a decade or two. So if I tell you, wow, there's something on YouTube right now and it's really retarded and isn't like very cool at all and it's like really lame, people would go, really? It's really lame? I got to go check that out, And so I'm amazed at like the content on YouTube. It's not like it's a bottomless pit of wisdom. Instead, it's all these collections of innate BS, inane BS, pardon me, not innate, inane. People like things because they're just like, kind of stupid. And so if you say, oh, I saw this movie, it's kind of stupid, people go, really? I should maybe check that out, So we're entering this age of irony where people like things because it's willfully stupid, Also, there's one more point I wanted to make here. Eggleston, something that wasn't said about him until I read recently as I was reading about a big retrospective that opened in Paris about him. He never chooses his own work for the exhibition. He actually will supply the curator with like 500 images to choose from. The curator will whittle it down to like 100 or 150, and then the prints will be made for that show. And for curators, they are sort of like wannabe artists, and they go, oh, I get to shape this exhibition by choosing what is there and what isn't. So Eggleston is very kind of passive and hands-off in a Warholian kind of way, and curators sort of like that because they don't have to argue with the artist. They get to shape exactly what the exhibition is going to be like. So I like probably 60% of William Eggleston's photographs. I find some of them really interesting. They're a kind of a vision into the last days of the Old South, where in spite of like this being post-civil rights movement, there's still some kind of vestiges of kind of the Old South that are still kind of hanging on. He's an insider, you know, born in Memphis, went to school in Mississippi and stuff like that. So he gives us an interesting point of view, and on top of that, the prints themselves are beautiful to look at. They are absolutely exquisitely made large dye transfer prints. Even a photograph like this reminds me of some of the things I've seen traveling through the South, where when people don't have cars and they have to go someplace where they got to look nice, they just walk a couple of miles, and that might be to get to their destination or to get to the nearest place where there's public transportation, and it's just part of what you see when you are down south. And this is new to people like Sharkovsky, who live very isolated in New York City. So I apologize, the focus is not exactly awesome on some of these, and I meant to ask Alex, if I could have ever got a moment to breathe, I would have asked Alex to what was up with our better projector, and has it come back from the repair shop yet. So I'm going to tweak up the focus here just for a second. That's a little better, and it'll probably ruin it for the next one. We'll see. So there's a huge debate in photography circles, in magazines, newspaper articles, in universities as to the importance of William Eggleston's work. This is the last photograph in the William Eggleston Guide. This is like the grand finale of his catalog, which is, it's an on-camera flash photograph of the inside of a oven that looks like it needs cleaning.
A dirty oven. That's funny when you said it needs cleaning. I said a dirty oven.
Yeah. So it's meant to be confrontational, and art sometimes is meant to be confrontational. I was talking with a student several years ago in this class who just loves William Eggleston, and I think they helped me a little bit to kind of understand his work. They pointed out that in other, say for instance, art mediums like music, sometimes people will use noise and dissonance as a way to kind of like to not just let you be lulled into a certain sense of complacency, but to kind of jar you and make you pay attention. And that this is kind of the equivalent of that, almost like visual dissonance, that will kind of make you kind of unsettled, and then think about what it is that you value in a visual experience. Anyway, the controversy continued because his next body of work was a body of photographs of flowers, and Iamber Cranbrook bought like all 42 of this portfolio and then proudly exhibited it in their museum, and I went to see it. I was an art student at the time, and I was like, really? It's like, You bought 42 of those, and I'm guessing you paid a pretty substantial amount of money in the tens of thousands of dollars, at the very least, even back in the 70s, for that. That was something that, again, just got the discussion going. And in this era now where we just take, Kim Kardashian, for real and say, oh, of course she's a star because someone says she's a star. Eggleston has continued in his career to occasionally release bodies of work, and some of it is just random, like this, And then others, I think, is actually kind of good. And I look at this and I say, okay, there's a really interesting play of light and shadow and use of color and silhouette and something about, again, that peripheral point of view of just seeing things out of the corner of your eye and yet recognizing that there's uncommon beauty there. And so here from his Louisiana project, common what were considered in one era photo mistakes, like having a tree growing out of somebody's head or having somebody just mugging for the camera when you point the camera at them. This is the Facebook era. Everybody mugs for the camera when you point a camera at them. I can't raise my camera and point it at my grandkids anymore without them immediately dropping into the standard Facebook poses, So it's a guy that was ahead of his time. And so Eggleston has continued to be heralded as one of the giants of the new color photography. Okay, let's take 10 minutes and then we will talk about another color photographer, Joel Meyerowitz. But some of you didn't get much of a break between the quiz. We'll hit pause. Okay, I'm going to continue now. We're going to look at the work of Joel Meyerowitz. And Joel Meyerowitz is another photographer who is part of the new color photography of the 1970s. Color photography, we went all the way through the 60s. I don't think we saw even a splash of it. But as we move into the 70s and beyond, color becomes more and more just a regular portion of the photographic world. Actually, by now, of course, you recognize that it's like 95% of that world, and that includes art photography. Joel Meyerowitz actually studied to be an art director. He studied graphic design and graduated from Ohio State University studying graphic design in 1959, and then went to New York and started working as an art director. As he was there as an art director, he met several famous photographers. He met Robert Frank while he was working at different magazines. He started being interested in street photography, started making his own street photographs. He ran into Gary Winogrand photographing out on the street and introduced himself and got into a conversation with Gary Winogrand and became friends with him about discussing street photography and so on. And so here we've got an early image from 1969 of a fashion shoot going on, and at the same time we've got kids jumping off the bridge into the lake, river, wherever they're at there. And so Meyerowitz originally starts off with working with black and white photography. And you can sort of see the influence of Gary Winogrand in that he's really interested in moments where there's almost more going on in the frame than the camera can contain. He is interested in kind of wading in and using either flash or fast shutter speeds to freeze action. the change comes when Joel Meyerowitz, and I'm going to maybe tweak the focus again here, decides that Leicas are small. 35 millimeter Leicas are small. And so therefore he can load one with black and white film and one with color film. And he can keep one in each pocket. And he'll go out on the lunch breaks in New York City and he will make photographs. So tweaking the focus here. In a time when the world is saturated with black and white street photographers, at a time when color photography is emerging as the new exciting thing that's going on in photography, Meyerowitz is now making these street photographs and liking them quite a bit. And so he says, okay, well, what's the next step after this? He's in touch with what's going on within the new topographics movement. And so he decides, well, 35 millimeter, everybody's got a 35 millimeter camera. I'm going to get me an 8x10 view camera. So in 1976, he buys an 8x10 view camera. He's going to be spending the summer in Cape Cod. And so he begins to photograph Cape Cod with an 8x10 view camera. And these photographs, again, they're very, very beautiful. These are actually chromogenic prints, C prints. But these all become a project that becomes known as Cape Light. And they look at the changing light of this seascape setting. And painters have been fascinated with the unique light of seascapes and been trying to document it for years. But Meyerowitz brings a somewhat different sensibility. Some of them are traditionally beautiful, and then others, again, are a little bit introducing elements of the urban landscape, challenging expectations as far as what is appropriate or interesting content. He oftentimes likes to juxtapose artificial light, such as fluorescent lights, with the color of the natural light of the sky. And it's probably worth noting that the new topographics photographers and Joel Meyerowitz are kind of influenced a bit by the photorealist painters who are operating in the 1960s and 70s, who actually use photographs of mundane subjects as their source material and then make very large paintings of these kind of things. When these photographs were finally made, collected, and printed in the opening of his book, Cape Light, Joel Meyerowitz wrote this down, and he said here, John Sharkovsky has used the expression nominal subject matter for much of today's photography. I think this is perfect for what may be for my behavior here. I'm not really interested in gas stations or anything about gas stations. This happens to be an excuse for seeing. Last year, on the first night I was here, I saw that raft against the side of the building. I caught my breath and I said, oh, that blue. I didn't see it say, oh, that blue raft. I saw pure color. I saw the blueness itself. It was never a piece of American kitsch. It was never a little social comment on a bungalow with American junk. It was the purity of seeing. So Meyerowitz, certainly a bit more of a traditionalist than Eggleston. He organizes his photographs in a more conventional sort of way. At times he is capturing the decisive moment, like this moment of lightning as it is happening at twilight, and the mix of the tungsten light and then the twilight sky. But again, he also, these people, they're not interested in saying, oh, look at American pop culture. It's so unsophisticated, decadent, whatever, consumerist. He's like, yeah, yellow bug lights are cool. They're pretty. They look awesome against the blue sky. And so all of these shot small f-stops. Again, 8x10 view cameras, so they're exquisite prints. They can be made very large. This one is titled Red Interior, and you can see how he's probably just noticed that when the car doors are left open as people are unpacking, moving into a cottage they're renting for the weekend, that the lights of the interior come on. There's interesting color there, and now juxtaposed against the moon, juxtaposed against the color of the street light, you get all these interesting colors. We take this stuff to Brandon now. But again, like a lot of the things in photography, photographic history, we see where it starts, who did it first, who recognized it first. So he did a series of photographs of a particular bay where the tide would go in and out, the weather would change. The prints are oftentimes as large as the projection here on the screen. And again, made from 8x10 negatives, so you can have things very minimal in the frame, like this single person there, and then really still make them out very well and see who they are and what they are as we look at the prints. So this is from his Bay and Sky sub-series that's a part of Cape Light, and looking at the way that as the tides go in, the tides go out, as the weather and light changes, different things happen that are all worth recording, and there's all these subtle nuances to the landscape and to the light. After the success of Cape Light, he was asked to photograph the anniversary of the construction of the St. Louis Arch. He was one of the 2 or 3 leading color photographers, maybe contemporary photographers of this particular era. So the city of St. Louis gave him a commission to make a body of work documenting the arch. And what he did is he looked at the way that the arch could be seen from all portions of the city, and sometimes it was right up in front of you and very obvious and very impressive. And anybody who's ever been to St. Louis and stood underneath this thing, it's a pretty amazing kind of location. So again, much oftentimes like in his Cape Light book, photographing at twilight, getting weather conditions.
It goes over the river.
It's by the river but does not go over the river. You can go in it. There are barrel-like elevators that turn sideways and roll as you're going up the side of it. But notice here, here's the arch again. So it's a photograph about the arch, but it's also looking at the kind of peripheral neighborhoods here. This is hilarious. I totally want to send some people to that location. You know? So Meyrowitz continues to be interested now in documenting effects of light, but then focused around a particular subject. And so being a New Yorker, when he goes back to New York, he starts off doing a series on the Empire State Building, and doing this during the late 70s and early 80s. And again, because the Empire State Building, one of the tallest building, at one time the tallest building, here he is able to capture details of New York life, the color of the changing light, and also the fact that the New York, or the Empire State Building is one of the icons of the New York skyline.
Hey Rob,
Yes?
did he switch formats or did he continue to use 8x10 for that?
8x10 all the way to today. So once he changed, there was no going back for him. So he's an 8x10 dude to this day, which he maybe regretted actually during this project here a little bit. So he was actually working on a project after the Empire State Project where he was documenting the World Trade Center towers and had just started that, maybe had about 10 or 15 images for that when the 9/11 attacks happened. And interestingly, you know, New York City is like ground zero for all photography, for all photojournalists. You're not using that term ground zero in the way that it's usually used, but it's just like that's where everybody is, that's their base of operations. If you're a photojournalist, if you're an art photographer, if you're a fashion photographer. So every photographer went and tried to photograph the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And some of you maybe will remember this, but a day or so after the attacks, and we were all kind of like just you know, taken aback by it, and everybody was kind of speechless for about a day. Everybody was glued to their television sets. I remember seeing this actual clip that they would run over and over again, and it was some police lieutenant, just some random guy, who said, yeah, you know what, the one thing we don't want is a lot of photographers down here, right? And he actually instructed his policemen that were starting to secure the Ground Zero site to arrest anybody who tried to make photographs, which you think they got enough on their hands. Why the hell would they want to do this, right? But it's profoundly stupid, but it's a profoundly stupid world. So Joel Meyerowitz was watching TV, saw this clip, which ran multiple times during the coverage because it was 24/7 coverage for about at least 2 weeks on the attacks. And he said, who is this random police lieutenant to say that you cannot document one of the most important events in the history of the United States? So he went to the Museum of the City of New York, and he asked the director of the Museum of the City of New York to give him a letter asking for cooperation for photographing and documenting the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. He then, 2 days later, took his 8x10 view camera, bunch of film holders, put them all in a backpack, stopped at a hardware store, got one of those painting masks that you know, if you're going to do drywall, walked the 6 or 8, 10 blocks in past the police barricades, went to the first barricade and said, hey, I've got this letter from the city of New York saying that I have, you know, asking for your cooperation in documenting this. The policeman turned him away. It was Sergeant so-and-so, right? It was Sergeant Jim Hansen. So he said, okay, but what's your name? He said, I'm Sergeant Jim Hansen. So he then walked a quarter mile, walked around the edge of the perimeter, went to another place and said, I just talked to Sergeant Jim Hansen here. I have this letter from here. I'm here to photograph this. The guy let him through. And so he spent the next 2 weeks doing that. And inevitably he would photograph for a couple of hours. Someone would come up to him and say, hey, what the hell are you doing here? And he'd say, well, I've got this letter, and these guys told me it was cool. And they said, well, yeah, you got to leave, right? So he would go home, stay up all night developing his film, make proof sheets, bring photographs to prove that he'd been photographing there again, and then go in from another edge of the perimeter and come in the next day, and did that over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, never ever having official permission. Eventually, after he had this body of work, he then went to somebody in authority and said, listen, I'm tired of playing this stupid game of having to lie my way onto the site. Look at all this stuff here. Officially, Joel Meyerowitz was declared the only civilian photographer who was allowed to photograph the Ground Zero recovery and cleanup efforts. I later have found out 10 years later, you know, as there was those specials for the 10-year anniversary of the attack, there was a FEMA photographer that, you know, the federal agency that was also documenting this, but they were doing it for the government, okay? And their work was the stuff that was sometimes getting released to news agencies and stuff like that. Meyerowitz, the only civilian that did it. And again, he did it because when someone told him no, he said, oh, hell no. You don't have the authority to tell me no, you know? I answer to history, and I will find a way to do it. And so now, of course, as you can imagine, the city of New York has given him a commendation for his efforts to document this. Meyerowitz was smart enough that when he went there, he not only made photographs of the wreckage, the devastation, and the cleanup, but he also did portraits of the guys who were cleaning it up. And so as he came back with photographs, he always had a few portraits and said, hey, look at how I'm showing just how brave you guys are, how hard you're working, just what an amazing kind of thing you're doing here. And so he got all of the people who were doing the cleanup on his side, and so was able to make this very important body of work. Again, the...
Are there pictures of like arms and legs and buckets and stuff?
There are no photographs that I am aware of that have ever been released of what was obviously collected there, which was the recovery of bodies, the recovery of body parts. Actually, the FEMA photographer who was there, her name was Andrea Booker, maybe it's Boer, B-O-O-H-E-R, Andrea. She spoke of the fact that she had to document this kind of stuff, and that was the toughest part of her job. None of this stuff, or those sort of things, had ever been published, and so Meyerowitz was very respectful in the stuff that he did. And so this was published in 2006, the book Aftermath, the World Trade Center Archive. So he originally took one of the empty storefronts that had been cleaned out by, having to be evacuated for the, the cleanup effort, and put up a makeshift exhibition so people who were coming to try to get as close as they could to the site, they could then go into the storefront and see what was going on the site. As you can imagine, major museums have collected this work and so forth. And the weird thing is when you go to look for this book in the library here, it's not in the photography books, in spite of the fact that Meyerowitz made his name as an art photographer. But of course, it's in United States history is where the book is categorized and located on the shelves. Because I remember asking the librarians to buy the book, and I'm like, why did that book never arrive? I'm looking on the shelves, it's still not here yet, and then later on I come to realize it's on a whole different shelf, but it's there. So here, one more photograph from Aftermath. Yep. Okay, Robert Mapplethorpe. I think we'll do Mapplethorpe, and then we'll come back for just a quick half-hour summation of contemporary photography, revivalists in the early days of digital. But Mapplethorpe, a hugely important photographer who became actually more important after his death because of all the controversy that his photographs generated. This is a dual self-portrait from 1980 of Robert Mapplethorpe as his kind of butch side and his femme side here. There's something to that. The comment is the student said he looks like David Bowie, but Mapplethorpe's sensibility came about during the glam era. And of course, David Bowie was very focused on like New York City and so forth, the Max's Kansas City scene. Robert Mapplethorpe was a part of that circle. So Mapplethorpe, he actually was a young man who was raised in the Catholic Church. His mother actually wanted him to grow up to be a priest. He was a Catholic altar boy, and a lot of people talk about how a lot of his work oftentimes has a certain element of kind of Catholic ritual, and also that kind of like good and evil dichotomy that is so much a part of the Bible and Catholicism and so forth. Mapplethorpe moved to New York City in 1969 and ran into a young fellow art student who was, had just come and was sleeping on park benches, Patti Smith. And actually this was 1967. And from 1967 to 1974, Robert Mapplethorpe and Patti Smith were roommates, lovers. At times they were partners in making art. When we were at the DIA, I think there was mention of the fact that there's going to be a Patti Smith photography exhibition that's going to be opening in June. And so as the Detroit Revealed show comes down, the next show that's going up is going to be actually Polaroids by Patti Smith. And Robert Mapplethorpe starts out as a photographer using the Polaroid camera. Anyway, Patti Smith worked in a bookstore. Robert Mapplethorpe was a struggling art student who oftentimes did collage. And he would oftentimes actually go to the bookstores where Patti Smith was working or other bookstores around New York City and steal art books for cutting up for collages. And he would also steal gay pornography for cutting up and making into collages. And so at this point, he was conflicted. He was trying to be heterosexual, but at the same time, he was recognizing that he was gay. And this was a time when, just like David Bowie, suddenly it was becoming actually sort of almost fashionable to be gay. And so if ever there was a time where it started to be easier to come out, it was the mid to late 70s. And so somebody gave him a Polaroid camera, and he began to make Polaroids. And so his first subject, his first model was, again, his roommate and co-conspirator, Patti Smith here. And notice he's included the kind of double entendre phrase here of the packaging that goes over a package of Polaroid film. Mapplethorpe was a bit of a social climber. He wanted very much to be accepted in Andy Warhol's circle. And so he and Patti Smith would hang out at Max's Kansas City. Patti Smith, in her book that just came out, and her memoir about her time in New York with Robert Mapplethorpe, Just Kids, won the National Book Award for nonfiction in 2010. They're actually doing a screenplay of it right now to turn it into a movie. Anyway, she recounts that in spite of this image, she was relatively shy and not really into socializing. He very much was interested in climbing the social ladder, so he began to introduce himself to different curators and tried to get them to be interested in collecting his work. He was given a Hasselblad camera by Sam Wagstaff. Sam Wagstaff went on to be the curator of contemporary art at the Detroit Institute of Arts, another Detroit connection here. So Sam Wagstaff and he eventually became lovers, but Mapplethorpe used his slowly climbing the social ladder as a way to build his photography career. And so he began to make photographs with a Hasselblad camera. He knew that he was very good at making very beautiful, elegant images. He also was more and more interested in the sadomasochism and bondage and discipline kind of aspect of what was going on in New York nightlife at the time. So he was photographing that, and he had two exhibitions that opened up simultaneously in 1977. One for the more traditional art crowd, featured his more traditional portraits and still lifes, and then had at the exact same time a second show that opened up of his images of the gay scene, oftentimes dealing with sadomasochism and bondage and discipline as a kind of recreational activity. So Mapplethorpe is known for his very elegant, very beautifully lit kind of classical studies of things like flowers, portraits, images like this. So here, calla lily from 1984. And the one that we have in our lab from 1988. And I'm guessing the shape of that calla lily probably sort of resonates, and it's not, a accident. Interestingly, I just got to tell you, the poster that we have in our photo lab, one of our students went to some sort of IKEA-like decorating store and said, man, this is a great black and white photograph. I'm going to put it up in my apartment. And then later on, his friends came over and they went, that's Robert Mapplethorpe. Do you know what kind of photographs he makes? And now this person was embarrassed to have this poster in their house, and they said, here, Rob, do you want this for the photo lab? I said, yeah, of course I want it. And so we got a free Robert Mapplethorpe poster because he got tired of being teased. People, of course, aren't quite as homophobic, at least in the blue states, as they used to be. So Mapplethorpe made very beautiful images of men. He had an interesting sort of eye and sensibility. He sought out these two men here, both who suffer from alopecia. Again, that's that condition where you have no body hair. And you can see how he is arranging them. Ken Moody is the gentleman here. He photographed him over and over again, African-American gentleman. But of course, he also made photographs that were definitely on the raunchier side, and made photographs that really pushed the boundaries for, again, what is considered to be socially acceptable in an art photograph. We saw work in the previous weeks where people are making work that's controversial because they're saying, oh, this subject matter that's kind of taboo, I will cross that boundary. I will kind of like show that taboo. And people are fascinated by this stuff, I can actually now, things dealing with human sexuality, I can watch that on basic cable on the Smithsonian Channel, But it's not like it was in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s when things were more taboo. So here in this triptych, we have the charming image of a man urinating into another man's mouth. And so Mapplethorpe, you say ooh, Robert Mapplethorpe says cha-ching, okay? Mapplethorpe was hugely successful in his lifetime. He went from literally being a starving artist where he and Patti Smith were sharing a single can of tomato soup to now, when he died, being a multimillionaire, okay? So his work, very highly collected. Books of his work, I mean, if you just simply go to Amazon.com, there have been at least 20 books of photographs, of Mapplethorpe's photographs, that have been published during his lifetime and since his death. He died in 1989 of AIDS. His photographs, I actually think his S&M photographs sometimes rely so much on the shock factor that they just don't seem as successful of photographs to me as his other photographs, because you look at this and it's like the lighting's kind of like so-so, the composition's kind of so-so, it's just kind of dead center. It's like, again, it kind of follows the snapshot aesthetic, except for the fact that kind of like Diane Arbus, it's like, oh, there's just people at home dressed up in their, Saturday, they're going to have a date night,
How much of his fame do you think has to do with Robert Allen with Patti Smith? Isn't she from here, and like her son married?
Patti Smith moved here, actually. So Patti Smith is not from here. I'm not sure if she's like from New Jersey or from Illinois. She went to New York to make her name as an artist. She was successful in the CBGB's early punk rock days. As she was interested in punk rock, she got interested in Detroit rock. And of course, one of the early proponents of punk rock before there was such a thing, the MC5, the Motor City 5. So after she broke up with Robert Mapplethorpe, she married Fred Sonic Smith from the MC5. and they moved to Detroit and lived here until he passed away. And yeah, now her son, Jackson Smith, is a musician who plays with, like, you know, in the Jack White Circle and stuff like that. Yep, there's a whole lineage here. Anyway, unfortunately, in the mid-1980s, the HIV/AIDS epidemic broke out. And it was big news in the world. It was big news in artistic circles because there's a lot of gay people in artistic circles. This always kind of makes it kind of difficult for me. I had 2 students die during this era where they were 22, 23 years old, and it's like all of a sudden they'd start coughing in class. A month later, they'd come whisper to you that they weren't going to be able to come to class anymore. And those were the days when you whispered about it because people would shun you if they found out that you had AIDS because nobody understood it yet. And then 2 months later, they'd die and I'd have to go to their funeral. So in artistic circles, a lot of people were casualties of the AIDS epidemic until they started to get drugs that would help to manage HIV so that it didn't go to full-blown AIDS. So Mapplethorpe made this self-portrait here, and he knows he's got HIV. It's a death sentence. He's going to die within 6 months. His lover, Sam Wagstaff, also contracted AIDS, died as well, and a bunch of other people in artistic circles as well. So, after he passed away, they put together a retrospective exhibition of his work entitled The Perfect Moment. So he died in 1989. They knew he was dying. Word was being whispered about that Robert Mapplethorpe's going to be passing soon. We should maybe start putting together an exhibition. So he was able to actually help to participate in organizing this exhibition. It started out at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and it had no problems there. And then this exhibition toured to several other institutions. It was scheduled to be shown at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The Corcoran had it on their schedule, and then they started to hear that there were maybe possibilities that people were going to try to have it shut down for obscenity. And so they backed out at the last minute on exhibiting it. There was a huge protest from the art community. So the art community got together, and this is kind of interesting. They got a slide projector like I've got here, and they projected all of the images of the exhibition on the wall of the Corcoran Gallery because the Corcoran was too chicken to put the exhibition up. Okay? But this then got a lot of media attention as to whether or not Robert Mapplethorpe's art was obscene or not. Okay? The exhibition then traveled to the, let me find my place on the page here, the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati. And Donald Wildman, who was head of the American Family Association, which is a more right-leaning organization, supposedly to protect the family, contacted the sheriff of Cincinnati and said, oh, there is pornographic art being shown at the Contemporary Arts Center. You should raid it. You should shut it down. Now, to see the exhibition at the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, you had to be 18 years or above to get in. You had to pay to get in. They had Mapplethorpe's X portfolio, which is the name of the portfolio that holds all of the gay S&M images, in a separate room from the rest of the exhibition. And they had a little warning sign there and a barrier, right, that said, warning, the X portfolio is in this room. If you don't like sexually explicit art, don't go into this part of the exhibition. So I'm not sure how the family was being protected by raiding and arresting Dennis Berry, the director of the museum, and putting him on trial for public obscenity. But we literally had a public obscenity trial where they went to his house and arrested him and put him in handcuffs in front of his kids for putting up this exhibition, and he was put on trial for obscenity and found not guilty, but not before the Museum of Contemporary Art lost all of its corporate funding, because what corporation wants to be, sponsoring the pornographic museum? In addition to this is Robert Mapplethorpe's self-portrait of himself with a bullwhip inserted in his anus. During the trial, no news organizations would actually show the photographs that were put on trial. There were 7 of them as singled out as being obscene. There were 5 of them dealing with homosexuality, and 2 of them, quote unquote, dealing with nudes of minors. And talk radio talked about this like crazy, and they're like, oh, these images are so pornographic, I can't even describe them on the air. And news stations would talk about them. Nobody would actually see them, but everybody had opinion on them, even though they hadn't seen them, okay? So here's one of the 2 pornographic images of children that were in there. I was looking a little bit kind of disheveled and trying to get things organized before class here today. I went to get the other image of the other child, which is a photograph of a young boy who is naked, who's basically playing on the edge of his couch. That boy was so kind of pro-Mapplethorpe that he agreed to have the Village Voice photograph him again when he turned 18, sitting on the same couch naked. So I have somewhere down in a folder downstairs that I forgot to bring upstairs, printouts of both of them, but you can find them on the web as easy as I found them. Both families gave affidavits that they were present during the shoots, and they didn't think that the images were obscene. They thought they were cute. But it makes for good press on the radio of like, oh, children, they can't give informed consent. Interesting little side story. Back when I used to read the newspaper, I'm reading the Sunday editorial pages, and they're writing about the Mapplethorpe controversy. One of my colleagues from the college writes in and says, oh, okay, people of, that are consenting adults can do whatever they want to. That doesn't bother me at all, but children can't give their informed consent for making photographs, so I totally agree that these should be found obscene because they are, photographs of children. So I wrote in the next week and I said, you know what? I also teach at OCC, because the person had put their, Professor, English, Oakland Community College, Royal Oak. I wrote in the next week, Professor, Photography, Oakland Community College, Royal Oak. I said, both these photographs are in our library, So if you really find them obscene, have you seen them? Because they're in the freaking library, and all you got to do is go over to the photo shelves, get the book down on Mapplethorpe, and bang, there they both are. And he apologized to me. He said, yeah, you're right. I didn't see them, didn't go looking for them, so maybe I was voicing my opinion without being too informed. Anyway, afterwards there was a debate about the National Endowment for the Arts. How the National Endowment for the Arts was funding obscene art.
Well, is this
Sacrilegious?
I mean, whatever.
My Halloween costume from 1960 when I was 5 years old was being the devil. So I guess I was sacrilegious in 1960 by playing the devil for Halloween. But it's definitely meant to be provocative. Yeah, maybe it's supposed to be sacrilegious, absolutely. But the interesting thing is, Robert Mapplethorpe never got a National Endowment for the Arts grant. He was the person who was the poster boy for defunding the National Endowment for the Arts, and they cut all individual artist grants from the NEA. Mapplethorpe never got an NEA grant, okay? They never said this in all of the discussions, but the way the NEA came into play is that the Philadelphia Museum of Art got an NEA grant to support their exhibition schedule. And they put on 6 exhibitions that year. One of the 6 was the Robert Mapplethorpe The Perfect Moment exhibition that eventually toured to the Cincinnati Contemporary Arts Center. And that's the only connection there is to the NEA and Robert Mapplethorpe. Okay? Mapplethorpe never, but then they said, we don't want the NEA funding the creation of obscene art. And so the NEA, half its budget was cut, and all individual arts grants were cut.
What about Jesse Helms, the senator?
Jesse Helms was the senator at the time. He was one of the leading people that was arguing for the defunding of the NEA. An interesting thing I learned from hearing Joel Peter Witkin speak is Jesse Helms felt he was getting such good political mileage out of Robert Mapplethorpe that he said, I'm going to show other people that make obscene and decadent art. And so he took one of the rooms on the chambers that are on the boundaries of the floor of the Senate, and he took a Joel Peter Witkin book and tore pages out of it and laid them all out on tables and invited his fellow senators to come and view his gallery of decadent art. And about halfway through the day as he was doing this, somebody whispered to Jesse, he said, Jesse, you might want to change the name of this because Adolf Hitler did the same thing when he took all of the German Expressionist paintings and put them up for ridicule and then burned them the next day. And Joel Peter Witkin is, Jesse Helms very quickly took down the pictures and pretended that that hadn't happened. And Joel Peter Witkin says, I would have been the next guy to get crucified after Mapplethorpe because they were making such good political kind of hay out of all of this controversy, except for this one miswording here. And so then Jesse Helms then backed away from that phrase and from Joel Peter Witkin and just continued to concentrate on Mapplethorpe.
Is that Mapplethorpe there?
That's Mapplethorpe's self-portrait there.
He looks just like Eric Roberts.
Yeah, everybody looks like somebody else. He's a good-looking guy. He was a gay man. All of the gay curators, they wanted to be his friend, you know. And so it helped him to ascend the ladder. I think at the same time he's also undeniably talented. And he also undeniably wanted to be a provocateur, and he got probably even more than he expected. But actually, a good amount of it was after he was dead, so he never even knew of it. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute or 5-minute break, and then we're going to sum up. We're going to go over contemporary photography and the birth of digital photography. Okay, the period of art that we are in right now, and we maybe are almost on like the far outside of it, edge of it, waiting for like the next new thing after this, but the era that we're in right now is oftentimes referred to as the postmodern period. So we went through modernism during the early part of the 20th century. As we approached the latter portion of the 20th century and into the 21st century, what does postmodern mean? It means after modern, something that comes after modern. And a lot of postmodern photography is very much a reaction to and a rejection of and questioning of all the things of modernism. And in one sense, it's funny how it kind of flips back a little bit, and some of it is reminiscent of like pictorial photography and say, for instance, some of that early photography from the pictorialist era. Cindy Sherman is almost considered to be like the poster girl for postmodernism in that she makes photographs of herself, and she oftentimes poses in such a way that it's obviously that she's in costume, that we're dealing with a certain artificiality. It's not that different in a sense from Julia Margaret Cameron's photographs, you know, from the pictorialist era. But there's some general attitudes about postmodernism. First of all, irony. Again, irony, the definition of that is to express something that is the opposite of the word's literal meaning. Expressing the opposite of the word's literal meaning, or using a word in the way that's the opposite of what it's supposed to mean. So if you say, wow, that's like really good, you're being ironic because it's obviously the opposite of that. And so we have become so kind of reflexively ironic where something is so lame that it's awesome, or it's so kind of artificial, but they meant to do it that way, you know? So irony is a big component of postmodernism. Oftentimes people, if they create an illusion, they make sure that you know that it's an illusion. They show the seams. They show the artificiality of it all. There's a rejection that there is a boundary or distinction between high art and low art. And so there's more and more embracing of things that are relatively common and that were considered to be below the concerns of art. And now things like movies that are just something that are general entertainment. Most people watch 2 or 3 movies a weekend. Movies are a great kind of source of inspiration for art, whereas people would normally say, "Oh, I'm inspired by classic poetry or earlier art forms and that sort of thing." There's also a attitude. One of the words that's used to describe it is pastiche, P-A-S-T-I-C-H-E. P-A-S-T-I-C-H-E, pastiche, which means to paste together, a hodgepodge, a mashup. We are so inundated with information and entertainment and highbrow culture and lowbrow culture, and it all is coming at us faster than we can take it all in. The recognition is that we all are influenced by a multiplicity of sources. We can't deal with it. We can't control it even if we wanted to. And so why fight it? Acknowledge that you're going to be influenced by commercials. You're going to be influenced by commerce. You're going to be influenced by other things than the things you just learn in art school.
When was that taken?
So that one was 1978. There's just recently been a major retrospective of Cindy Sherman's work, but she started out doing these photographs, just 8x10s that she developed in the back of her apartment, where she would pose in costumes and character, wigs and stuff like that, and she would act out as though she was actresses in different types of films, and they're not meant to be portraits in the traditional self-portrait sense of showing something about Cindy Sherman, but instead she's play acting different roles of women and how they're portrayed in film. So later on, as she got more successful, your work becomes more kind of expansive. You can afford to change to a view camera. You can afford to have larger prints made. She continues her self-portrait series of portraying characters from, films that never existed in real life. She adopts this long panoramic format to mimic the format of the fold-out from a girly magazine. And she said that the use of this proportion of length to width is the proportion of what would normally be in the fold-out from Playboy magazine, but instead she's using that format for making her portraits. And now, most recently, or even almost most recently, because I saw some brand new stuff with this major retrospective, she's been intentionally kind of making things grotesque. And so she has gone to medical supply houses where they make either prosthetics for people that have lost the breast or things that are used for like medical and sexual education, and makes these different portraits, again, where notice you can see the seams where the breasts are fake. and just pressed onto her flesh there. And again, it's very much about the fact that this is an artificial construction. She's not like Julia Margaret Cameron in the fact that she wants you to think about Romeo or Juliet or the Whispering of the Muse, but you're supposed to be looking at, oh, look at how artificial this is. What is it that she's trying to say about the way that women are represented? So here's something from, again, that retrospective showing just the whole range of her early black and white stuff. Her most recent stuff has dealt with kind of representing kind of more privileged trophy wives and women that are of a certain age, and now their jobs are to basically redecorate and go to the tanning booth. Joel Peter Witkin is a photographer who, again, creates scenes to be photographed. So there's that same kind of thing of, like in the previous photographic rule book, you didn't set things up to be photographed because that was either something that a commercial photographer did or that's what the old-fashioned pictorialist photographers did. Joel Peter Witkin now does these sorts of photographs that are very much staged, directed, costumed, but of course they have a more kind of edgier content to them. And so this particular one here, which I usually actually rely on the fact this is 1987, you can see that he scratches on his negatives and oftentimes distresses the prints that he's making or the negatives that he prints from so that they, in a sense, look almost like 19th century glass plate negatives, but then have these really bizarre sorts of scenes that are depicted within them. So we saw this particular photograph at the DIA here. It's an image of a woman who is not traditionally beautiful by Playboy magazine sort of standards. She's been propped up with these kind of feet and wings from birds that have been taxidermied, and it has a certain kind of bizarre, unsettling kind of quality to it. I remember the first time I saw The Biggest Loser, and I said, really, we're going to look at a whole series, a whole season of people with their shirts off when maybe we were not used to that. But those boundaries, it's funny, what used to be provocative now is just on mainstream network television and so forth there. But Joel Peter Witkin oftentimes references historical painting. And so he will take a portrait or a scene from 17th and 18th century painting and then recreate it with this kind of bizarre twist to it in his contemporary photographs. So oftentimes in postmodern photography, there's a certain attitude that everything has been done, and so the only thing to do is to kind of like regurgitate it in a new form that references it while at the same time hopefully unsettling you. So still lifes, we could go through the DIA and we could find still lifes with fish and grapes on a table and stuff like that. But Joel Peter Witkin was photographing at a university that also had a med school, and so they had a cadaver lab there where he had access to photographing cadavers that were being dissected by med students, and he would then include cadavers in his still life studies. So again, that urge to be provocative, very much still alive today, and a quick way of getting recognition. This is the work of Sandy Skoglund here. And Sandy Skoglund, this is her piece, Radioactive Cats. There's a lot of photography that you can say represents, again, that pictorialist kind of thing of putting people in costume into a kind of constructed set. There's also an element of cinematography to this because commercial photographers routinely pose people, pose things to create a kind of a fantastic scene. Cinematographers do the same thing. Sandy Skoglund makes all these sculptures, paints them, paints the whole damn room so the whole room is the same uniform color. Sometimes actually paints the suit and the dress that the people are wearing here, and then photographs it all with a view camera. Sandy Skoglund actually spoke here at OCC Royal Oak, and when she was here, it was during the earlier days of digital photography, and everybody said, hey, wouldn't that just be easier if you just like did it digitally and cut and pasted all the cats and put them in there rather than having to cast all of these things out of plaster of Paris, paint them, and then set them all up in a set that you've constructed? And she said, no. It's like the thing that makes this photograph interesting to people is they can tell that it's both real and fake at the same time. So you could see that there were real live people next to real plaster of Paris cats there. And any kid that's in a media class in junior high school can cut and paste in Photoshop, but not many of them will say, okay, I'm going to build a whole room, fill it full of sculptures, and then pose real live actors with the sculptures with the goal of making a single photograph of it. Pardon me? And to be good at it, yes. So here, again, she works with very strong color and at the same time absence of color. You can see how she's painted everything in this room, like the dial telephone here and so forth, and then made all of these leaves herself and then re-photographing them. So that kind of wanting to kind of work like a painter and imagine something of your own and then to set it all up in front of the camera. That was done by Oscar Raylander and H.P. Robinson and Julia Margaret Cameron. Now in the postmodern world, it comes back but with a new kind of like a new kind of contemporary twist to it all. So Philip Lorca de Corsia, another photographer that is influenced by cinematography. He has set up a strobe inside of this refrigerator. And he saw somebody go and do what they do, which is stare, look into the fridge and say, is there anything good in here? And he said, oh, how can I recreate that? Most of us have difficulty because up until recently, photography materials have not been sensitive enough to kind of record what the eye sees. So he lights things using strobes to make it look like what we would see in real life. Now, advertising photographers, they've been doing this for like 20, 40, 50 years before art photography caught on. But now art photographers are basically doing what advertising photographers have done. And so he's just photographing what look like slice of life moments, but they're all directed by him. And again, that fact that he's breaking the rule that you don't set things up, that you don't kind of like misrepresent things. Anybody who walked into a gallery would never know that this was directed. They'd assume it was almost a journalistic sort of image. But these people don't feel like they have any sort of kind of like adherence to that rule book and are actually exploring what's happening along the edges there. So here setting up strobes at a gas station for something that's both artificially lit and yet very realistic at the same time. So it kind of straddles that line between journalism and directed commercial photography or say cinematography. Yep. I was reading a magazine the other day that started in 1967, and so on their back page each month they go, yeah, what was happening in this month in 1967? And they said, yep, gas shot up to 33 cents a gallon. And it's like, I sort of remember that, you know. Jeff Wall is another one of these photographers that in the postmodern realm very much makes highly constructed photographs where he will cast actors. He'll have an idea that's sketched out ahead of time, and then he will cause it all to come into being. He prints his photographs onto Duratrans. Duratrans is photo paper that's actually on plastic so that you can put fluorescent lights behind it, and now it lights up. And anytime you go to a restaurant or a, say for instance, a clothing store where you see illuminated photographs from behind, that's on Duratrans. And so that material was made for advertising, but now these photographers are going, well, I can use the tools of advertising, but I can then make photographs that deal with my own thoughts. And so here, a gust of wind by Jeff Wall here. And so here a photograph where he has kind of made a little one-frame movie. These are supposedly Russian soldiers who were killed during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan prior to our war with Afghanistan. And much like might happen in like a fantasy television show or movie, these are supposedly dead soldiers that are coming back to life after they've been hit by a shell, an explosion, an improvised explosive device, and kind of wondering what's happened to them as they have been killed in battle. So very much kind of replicating cinema, replicating contemporary entertainment. Another one of Jeff Wall's. As you can imagine, some of these photographers have embraced Photoshop as its qualities have improved. And so here he has photographed a cemetery and people in that particular cemetery. Later on, he photographed this scene of the kind of the sea urchins and things like that. That was actually constructed in his studio and lit and photographed and then composited together. So we'll get to actually Photoshop in a minute. Gregory Crewdson said his greatest inspiration were the movies of Steven Spielberg, and one of the things that he was especially inspired by was the fact that most movies at some point utilize a crane shot, where you put the camera into a large crane that raises the camera up and over the scene. And so most art photography is shot from eye level. So he went to his volunteer fire department and said, hey, can I use your rescue vehicle? I want to put a view camera up there and photograph down onto things. Carrie, you had a question?
When they did Real Steel, it was an extra at the Renaissance Center, and they went up, we were there overnight, and they had a crane behind us, and they were playing all this like music, and it was right on the river in the back of the Renaissance Center. And it was from a crane shot, so when you see Real Steel, it's when all the people are walking in the back.
Okay. She's talking about a crane shot that she participated in from the movie Real Steel, but crane shots are just a common thing in just about every motion picture, and yet incredibly uncommon in art photography. We saw that Ansel Adams realized if he just simply got up on top of his car, he got a more unusual point of view. So Gregory Crewdson is saying, you know what, I'm going to get way up above the scene. And I'm going to make photographs that resemble scenes from films. And not from some esoteric art film, but from like something like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So notice he's cast all of his neighbors as playing characters who are coming to see what's wrong with the one crazy neighbor who's decided to sod over his stretch of street here. And so this is from his series Hover. Notice he's even got the police department's cooperation, and one of the policemen is playing a policeman to come to see what's going on in this neighborhood disturbance. And Crewdson started out in black and white, moved on to color. Again, they look very much like scenes from movies. The prints are made from large negatives. The prints themselves are oftentimes 4 by 6 feet or larger. Therefore, you can work in a more subtle fashion, much the way on like the big screen for motion pictures. So this is Penitent Girl from 2001, in which he's gotten actors to play the young girl who, I guess, being in her underwear, she's penitent, and now she's being confronted by her suburban family. Richard Prince is a photographer that has done a technique known as rephotography. Rephotography is where you photograph something that already exists. This particular image is a photograph of a advertising for Marlboro cigarettes. And of course it invites the people from Marlboro to say, hey, you are violating our copyright. But just like in the age of sampling, people would say, oh, let's take something that already exists, make something new about it. In the early days of sampling, nobody cleared a sample. They just said, yep, let's see if they sue us. So Richard Prince doing the same thing. This particular photograph actually sold for $1.1 million recently at auction as a, wasn't this print, I think it's the next print that we're looking at here, but one from this series sold for that because it's considered to be an important milestone in postmodern photography. And he's literally just taken a magazine that has a Marlboro ad in it, laying it on a copy stand and rephotographing it. Nowadays, of course, he'd be putting it on a flatbed scanner and bringing it in that way, or just appropriating it by, selecting and copying it from the internet. Yes, you had a question, Tim?
Are you aware of the copyright infringement charge from a photographer for the state of Texas?
There have been several copyright infringement cases that I'm aware of. The one you're speaking of, which one is this?
It's against the state of Texas. They made license plates with an image of a silhouetted image of a cowboy. I forgot who the photographer was.
Okay.
And it was distinctly from that photographer.
So the state of Texas was actually sued for copyright infringement because they infringed on the rights of a photographer here.
I don't know if it actually went through.
I'll bet you that a settlement was reached, and it might even be, I cannot remember his name, but the guy who actually made all these Marlboro ads spoke at OCC, the posters downstairs in the darkroom. And it's an interesting sort of thing. The idea of appropriation goes back to Warhol, okay? Maybe even earlier than that. I know of different professors who speak of it and actually give an appropriation assignment where they say, go out and appropriate something from the real world, bring it into your artwork because that's like a new and edgy thing to do in art. I had one of my digital instructors, and he was giving an appropriation assignment to his class. And I said, oh, I teach copyright law here, and I know it's cool to stick it to the man and not, ask permission and kind of try to be kind of daring. I said, but are you willing to open up your portfolio and let students appropriate your work and then use it into their piece? And he's like, oh, no, nobody should be able to use my work. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why is it they can appropriate some things, but they can't appropriate from you? So you can sometimes find that kind of weird double standard. Shepard Fairey, for instance, appropriated the UPI photograph of Obama that was used for the Hope poster that some of us really like, and I actually still have a copy at home because I really like it. And Shepard Fairey was actually sued by the photographer and UPI for using that original photograph without their permission, and for him, of course, to ultimately somewhere profit. He donated it to the Obama campaign, but since then, original prints of that are being sold and collected by collectors and museums and stuff like that. And Shepard Fairey just recently lost a judgment and was found guilty of copyright infringement for basically using that photograph. But Richard Prince didn't have much money. He's got money now, but he didn't have much money when that happened, and so you stop and you wait and see, and you say, okay, well, let's see if they sue us. Again, postmodernism oftentimes seems to say, okay, what are the last things that haven't been done? And let's push them to the furthest extremes possible. Uta Barth makes photographs where she intentionally throws her camera profoundly out of focus and then photographs. And a lot of people say, oh, they're like Neo-Impressionism, because they deal strictly with light and shadow. They are totally devoid of subject matter. And they're so beautiful in their luminous qualities, and I agree. And I also think they're also Stevie Wonder snapshots at the same time, you know? It's like this kind of work actually gets traction because of the fact that it challenges those kind of definitions, and you say, okay, is this the work of somebody who was genius enough to think of this great idea, or somebody that just stumbled across something that's so stupid obvious and they went, yeah, nobody's done this yet because it's stupid obvious, I'll do it. This is where Dwayne Michaels said that he didn't necessarily think that people were necessarily untalented, but maybe at times overpraised. And this is the sort of work that Dwayne Michaels was responding to, and since I'm old and cranky like him, I sort of am in his camp. Andreas Gursky, somebody who is, again, trained by Bernd and Hilla Becher, makes giant photographs. I recently was trying to read more about Andreas Gursky, and he became famous because he was the first person to really make really gigantic photographs for 13, 15 feet across. He works with a 5x7 film view camera. This is his famous 99-cent store, and 99-cent store recently sold for over $3 million. Again, as a very important milestone in postmodern photography. Reading about Gursky, when he was an art student at the Dusseldorf Academy, there was a painter at the Academy who had just made very, very large paintings and had gotten a lot of local positive press and publicity and stuff like that. And Bernd told Gursky, said, hey, why don't you print your photographs really, really big? And Gursky's like, I don't think I can do that in the school darkroom. He said, well, take them to that commercial lab that prints all the commercial photographs. And I used to work in a commercial lab, and we used to make 12 and 14-foot photographs all the time for the auto show, but artists never did it before. And so now all of a sudden artists go, you know what? Thanks to Worrell, I don't have to print my own work anymore, so I can have my work printed as big as I can afford with my credit card. And since Gursky was the first one, he was suddenly uber famous for the guy that made the gigantic photographs. I actually like his photographs quite a bit. Here he has taken the Rhine River and very subtly taken that negative and scanned it and then straightened the river in Photoshop so that it's uber straight. Again, there's maybe something about that German need for order that's there,
Was that the photograph that was sold for $4 million?
That one sold for $4 million. Yeah, I can't keep track of all this stuff. I've got several notes here. It's 99-cent store went for this. And it's oh yeah, that one went for $4 million. So it's hard to keep up with all this stuff. Wolfgang Tillman, first photographer to win the Turner Prize in England for genius as an artist. He is known for his photographs. His first book was titled, If One Thing Matters, Everything Matters. And you'll notice he makes more traditional size prints, larger size prints, makes so many prints that when you hang them in a gallery, there's whole bunches of them you can't even get to see because they've run out of room and now they're hung at a distance where you can't even get in to view them close. But it's about, contemporary photography where nowadays all of us make millions of photographs. And if we were to print all the ones that we think are sort of good, we'd have our own multiple museum show. And again, the snapshot aesthetic still is living live, living strong, very much alive here. Making photographs oftentimes with larger cameras that are very straightforward. Some people say, oh, that's a very accurate documentation, a la August Sonder or someone like that, of what a young student looks like. Oh, he's got spray paint on his pants because he uses spray paint. At the same time, you look and you say, okay, not that challenging of a photograph to make. Maybe overpraised just a little bit. So Yeah, it looks like contemporary youth, but then every Facebook photograph looks like contemporary youth, you know? That's Wolfgang Tillmans, Thomas Ruff. Again, there's a certain kind of dispassionate trend in postmodern photography where you specifically try to make your work as kind of emotionless as possible. Certainly don't make it about any social issue whatsoever, because that's so kind of 60s passé. And so your photographs are about nothing. Reineke Dijkstra utilizes off-camera flash for documenting people. Her work is oftentimes compared to the work of August Sander, so photographing young adolescents at the beach. I think this is in the Ukraine. And again, this style of photography is always accompanied with large prints, so that you are kind of like life-size, eye-to-eye with these individuals. But these, I think, are actually kind of interesting in looking at that kind of awkward phase where you're half child and half adult. Here a series of young mothers, and photographing them all within 72 hours of giving birth. And of course, we love the beauty and the magic of birth, and yet looking at it, you know, including its real aspects of it, you know. So here, notice the post-birth kind of, I don't know if you would describe this as menstrual blood or placental blood. That's kind of like running down her leg, which is the reason why most mothers, after they've given birth, usually have to wear maxi pads for a week or so.
That's blood.
That's blood. But these from 1994. Work that is so personal that has almost a diaristic quality to it, that of diary. Nan Golden was a hugely influential photographer who photographed herself as she was hanging out with drunks and drug addicts and various skeezy people on the edges of society. So here her self-portrait after she was battered by one of her boyfriends from 1984. So in this age of oversharing, you know, what was once very kind of cutting edge like 10 years ago, now we just look at this as just kind of commonplace. But here photographing just her friends and what it's like to be young and maybe traveling through Europe. Eleanor Carucci photographs her own family, where she will utilize a remote camera that she sets up in her room and then photographs interactions between her and her family. So here a photograph of her mother and father together, so very intimate, personal photographs. Not even looking at the outside world at all, looking no further than her own family. We may run a few minutes late, I apologize, but I should probably just edit this carousel a bit. There's contemporary environmental photographers, Richard Mizrash, photographing what happens to the landscape. So here photographing desert fires, and obviously a concern for that. Edward Bertinsky, photographing nickel mining in Ontario. You'll notice that mining brings jobs. Mining brings pollution. It's a kind of awkward kind of like balance. It's like, okay, we want people to work. We also don't want to destroy our earth in the process. So they don't make real kind of statements beyond just kind of like, okay, here's the awkward, difficult reality that is for you to sort out, which is the land is being despoiled. At the same time, all of us need metal for our day-to-day consumer items. There are a number of photographers that have gone back and embraced early processes. I sometimes call these people the contemporary revivalists. This particular image here, made with a camera obscura here, Aberaldo Morel takes whole rooms and turns them into camera obscuras. Now he sets up a view camera inside of his camera obscura and does 8-hour exposures to photograph the resulting images of his constructed camera obscuras. Basically, he covers the windows with black plastic and then cuts a hole the size of a dime in it and then sets up his camera right up against the window so he can photograph the resulting camera obscura effect in the room. And he seeks out rooms with interesting viewpoints and vantage points. And so what was the very birth of photography, the camera obscura, still is fascinating, some 170 years later. And sooner or later you say, what do I do next? Well, if I did it in black and white, let's do it in color. This is a image by Adam Foose, who does photograms. Again, the earliest sort of photography. This is actually a photogrammed daguerreotype of a person. Sally Mann, she photographs early on her family. She's made photographs of her children with a view camera, so they have that kind of diaristic quality. In later years, she has gone back to make ambrotypes and wet plate photographs of her family. So making glass plate negatives and at times making ambrotypes of her family members. And we were talking beforehand about another wet plate photographer. This is her husband. He, I think, is suffering from multiple sclerosis now, and she's documenting him as he is dealing with his multiple sclerosis. But she's not particularly good at coating the glass, lets all those blemishes show. Part of the beauty of the surface quality and the evidence of process. So these are Sally Mann from 2002, Untitled Larry's Arm. Again, there's that kind of urge to be fascinated by death, fascinated by taboo. She actually had buried her dogs in the backyard as they had passed away. She had then been photographing a place where they did forensic photography and photographed bodies. That led her to dig up one of her buried greyhounds and photograph the bones of her deceased dog with the wet plate process. So here, wet plate photographs from a place in Virginia where they study crime. This is called the Body Farm. And so people have donated their body to science. They'll leave these bodies out on in the woods, sometimes covered up, sometimes just out. People who are CSI investigators in training can practice to figure out how long the person was there, what was their cause of death. She wanted to photograph there but thought it might be just a little bit too intrusive to make really sharp photographs, so she's made wet plate photographs of this. Chuck Close, a painter who actually suffered a brain aneurysm or a spinal aneurysm, paralyzed from the neck down, but he works with an assistant to make contemporary daguerreotypes. And so here, these are contemporary daguerreotypes by Chuck Close. And so nude studies here, lit with strobe in the studio, but then on a silver plate developed in mercury fumes. Jerry Spagnoli, his assistant, also makes contemporary daguerreotypes. So here a contemporary daguerreotype. And obviously he's gotten very good at making them and worked out ways to deal with the safety issues with the mercury fumes. Spagnoli had his studio in New York City, made this cityscape, this contemporary daguerreotype of the World Trade Center. And then, when the World Trade Center was attacked, he went up on his roof and made a daguerreotype of the World Trade Center as it was under attack and about to collapse from the roof of his studio. So we saw, daguerreotypes of different cataclysmic events. Here now in 2001, it's still going on. Okay, digital photography. This is an actual ad for Adobe Photoshop, okay? And it speaks to our urge of not being interested in the truth any longer, okay? So as I, am kind of interested in what's going on in the contemporary digital world, the attitude of people and so forth, this particular ad speaks 1,000 words. You might be interested to know that the inventor of Photoshop, Thomas Knoll, from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he actually wrote the first version of Photoshop while he was a PhD student at the University of Michigan in 1987. I was at the University of Michigan in 1985. I think if I just spent like 2 years later, I might have been able to just knock over his laptop and like stop him. But he still, to this day, multi-billionaire, lives in Ann Arbor. Every time you open up Photoshop, and it tells you all the people that are the owner of the patent for Photoshop, his name comes up first, followed by his brother, John. John Knoll worked for Industrial Light and Magic, and when he first came up with an image editing program for doing images in grayscale, he said, you know what? Keep working on that. That's going to be useful for like movies and stuff like that. And they then licensed what eventually came to be known as Photoshop to Adobe. And now, 12 versions later, I know it's like Creative Suite 5, but it's actually the 12th version of Photoshop. It's become the go-to kind of way for all digital photographers to make their photographs. Interestingly, virtually no digital photographer uses anything other than Photoshop. Yes?
Adobe Lightroom is also used.
Yeah, well, let's say nobody uses anything other than Adobe products. So the statement was, okay, they also use Lightroom. But yeah, it's something from Adobe. So everybody uses Crayola crayons.
So
Nobody uses any other crayons other than Crayola crayons.
Roz, is he kind of a recluse? He's a very low-key guy.
He's a recluse in the biggest sense of the word. Actually, I know some people who have met him. He supposedly is one weird dude. And he keeps himself way under the radar. You think of like Steve Zuckerberg and just what a kind of like a phenomenon he is and known within the culture. This guy has affected the culture at least as much as Mark Zuckerberg. And you've probably never seen his picture. When I went and tried to look up information on him on the web today, it's like you find just the barest bones of information about him. Obviously he licensed it to Adobe, continues to license it to this day, and so it's like that's a lot of licensing fees coming in. But I like to finish up for those people that are nice enough to stay late, and I really appreciate when you guys, we did the test and you stay in late here and stuff like that. The first digital photographer in my mind, Nancy Berson. Nancy Berson, I think, sets the bar for all other digital photographers. Nancy Berson was a painting student, and so she got her painting degree in the 1960s, moved to New York City. In 1969, she saw an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art called The Machine as Seen at the End of the Individual Age. I misspoke because I'm trying to rush. The Machine as Seen at the End of the Industrial Age. And as she was thinking about that exhibition after she left it, she said, wouldn't it be cool if there was a machine that would show you what you looked like as you got older? And so she actually went to MIT and she said, hey, I got this cool idea. Is it possible? They said, you know what? I don't think there's enough computing power to make this possible. But there were two scientists there that were interested in the idea and started working with her. And they eventually came up with, in the early 80s, a software program for imagining someone as they aged. And it was actually licensed to the Center for Missing Children, and all of those kind of milk carton pictures that you saw were all photographs that were done using this software. When they came about this, by the way, the two software engineers that worked with her were Richard Carling and David Kramlich, who she eventually married. Anyway, she licensed her this technology to People Magazine, and People Magazine did something like, oh, look at it's funny, here's famous celebrities, and now here's how they're going to look when they're older and saggier, you know? And so she got to thinking about the whole idea of celebrity and beauty. And so she started using computer software to combine together faces. And so here in the pre-Photoshop days, this is the face of Bette Davis, Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Sophia Loren, and Marilyn Monroe, 6 beautiful movie stars. And this is what they would look like if they were all, you know, cloned together into one kind of uber movie star. And of course, she said, okay, those are classic movie stars. What about contemporary movie stars from the day? So here, equal parts of Jane Fonda, Jacqueline Bisset, Diane Keaton, Brooke Shields, and Meryl Streep, all of whom were big actresses of the day. There was no such thing as a printer in this era. She learned photography by taking pictures off of her monitor screen so that she could then make photographs and then exhibit the photographs of the things that she was doing on her computer screen. So that's how she learned photography. What's good for girls is good for guys. So she went back to classic Hollywood movie stars here. Equal parts Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Gary Cooper, Clark Gable, and Humphrey Bogart. So the ultimate classic era movie star. And updated here, equal parts of Richard Gere, Christopher Reeve, Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson's not doing so good these days. Warren Beatty and Robert Redford. So looking at this idea of what is idealized beauty as said by Hollywood. She took 6 photographs of men, 6 photographs of women. Said, okay, what does androgyny look like? What happens if we get equal amounts of men and women? So here, androgyny from 1982, all with software she developed herself, and then photographs she made off the monitor because nobody from Epson or Hewlett-Packard had made a printer for her yet. The 3 major races, you can see a conceptual element coming into here. This is the Asian race, Caucasian race, and black race, all according to the percentage of the population that they are on Earth, and then mixed together. This is what we would look like if we all kind of intermarried. Ultimately, we'd all look like this one kind of blended person. Evolution, 33% chimpanzee, 33% gorilla, 33% man. Some people have noted this looks like one of our former presidents. If you're going to make the ultimate assassin, equal parts of Lee Harvey Oswald, Sirhan Sirhan, and James Earl Ray. Again, you can see that there's this conceptual element, the ultimate dictator here. Equal parts of Stalin, Mussolini, Mao, Adolf Hitler, and Ayatollah Khomeini. Warhead. This is photographs of the leaders of the world according to the percentage of nuclear weapons that they possessed. So equal parts of not equal parts, 55% Ronald Reagan, 45% Leonid Brezhnev, less than 1% of Margaret Thatcher, Francois Mitterrand, and Deng Xiaoping, leaders of England and of France and of China. Of course, we don't have Israel in there because Israel's never claimed to quite have nuclear weapons yet. We'd have to get, I think, Korea and Pakistan in there somewhere. Yes, so go into the Bible here. When the lion lays down with the lamb, this is what you get. a lot of people feel affinity with their pets, so she blended her face with that of her cat. And so Catwoman from 1983, putting herself into these sort of things, willing to put herself into this. Now, she and her husband, they got pregnant. They were going to have a baby. She was going to have a baby. She started having nightmares, which apparently is fairly common for pregnant women, where they have dreams about, oh, something weird is happening to my child, and it's the anxiety that hope your child will be born well. She started making photographs like this to kind of deal with those kind of things that were bothering her. When she showed them to people, they said, oh, God, you're awful for even imagining something like this. And she said, well, if I'm awful for imagining this ways, what happens to people where they actually have children that have birth defects? So she got herself a Diana camera and started photographing children with birth defects. She specifically chose a Diana camera because she wanted that softer quality that comes from that plastic lens so they wouldn't be too harsh. And started photographing children with birth defects and saying, okay, what happens when it's genetics that actually distorts the face? So here, children that suffer, I think it's progeria, which is that aging condition where they are born and they grow old very, very fast in their appearance, even though they are still physically children. And I find it kind of interesting. I think it's just like almost kind of like a nice way to kind of bring things full circle, that the person I think of as the first digital photographer came to darkroom photography and plastic toy camera photography through being the first digital photographer, and now came her way all the way back to a toy plastic camera after inventing like some of the first photo imaging software. Okay, so we are done. Thank you for staying. Obviously, this final lecture here is being rewritten every hour of every day.